Get ready for a spine-chilling experience. If you love feeling your heart race and the suspense creeping into the room, you're in the right place. But before we begin, I have an invitation for you. If you truly have the courage to face the unknown, go ahead and hit that like button now and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any terrifying stories. Share this video with someone who also loves the thrill of fear, but be careful. The scariest things tend to happen when you least expect it. Are you ready to face what's coming next? Let's see if you can handle it. Andreas Gruber was a man of few words, but many secrets. Hinterkaifeck's farm, isolated amid the icy Bavarian hills, was his fortress. His family had lived there for generations, far from the prying eyes of the city. However, over the past few months, Andreas had noticed something unsettling. First, there were the footprints in the snow, deep marks, as if someone had walked from the forest to the farm but never returned. He questioned his neighbors, but no one could explain. One freezing night, as snow fell silently across the fields, a distinct sound echoed through the house. Footsteps in the attic. Andreas slowly rose from the bed, his breath clouding in the dim candlelight. He climbed the stairs cautiously, the wooden floors creaking beneath his feet. But when he reached the attic, he found nothing but dust and darkness. Trying to ignore his growing fear, he went back to bed, convinced that they were just rats. In the following days, objects began to disappear. A key to the front door was missing, as were everyday tools. The eldest daughter, Victoria, mentioned that she felt as if they were being watched. The atmosphere on the farm was increasingly heavy, with a feeling of an invisible and threatening presence. But Andreas, stubborn and suspicious, refused to believe that something truly sinister was happening. He did not know that evil was already among them. That fateful week, time seemed stagnant. The nights were long and silent, interrupted only by the occasional creak in the attic. Each member of the family felt the weight of something unsaid, something none of them dared admit. The morning before the massacre, Victoria told her mother, Kazilia, that she had dreamed of someone standing at the foot of her bed, watching her sleep. Kazilia, however, did not listen to him, attributing the dream to the recent strange events that were shaking everyone. The tension was palpable. Andreas, bothered by the noises and disappearances, decided to lock all the doors and windows that night. He believed the family was safe, but deep down something bothered him. The footprints in the snow never left his mind. How could someone have come to the farm and disappeared without a trace? He didn't know that the danger was already there, in a place he couldn't imagine, above them in the shadows of the attic. That night, the family gathered for dinner, but the discomfort was evident. The silence was broken by a distant sound, like the scraping of furniture. "It must be the wind," muttered Andreas, although he knew the wind couldn't do that. Later, when everyone went to bed, an unusual cold took over the house. Sleep didn't come easy to anyone, and it was in this disturbing stillness that the terror began to unfold. In the cold morning of March 31st, 1922, the silence was broken by a dull noise. Andreas was the first to get out of bed, sensing something was wrong. When he went downstairs, he found the kitchen door open, despite having locked it hours before. The cold wind that entered made his body shiver, but true terror hit him when he saw the figure in the barn. Cautiously, he went out to investigate but never returned. Kazilia, suspicious of her husband's absence, also went to the barn. There, what he found made his heart stop. Andreas was dead, his face brutally smashed with an agricultural tool. Before he could scream, he felt a presence behind him. The last thing she heard was the whisper of something non-human, before she was brutally beaten. One by one, each family member was lured into the barn, where they met the same fate. Victoria fought but had no chance. Clara, the 7-year-old granddaughter, was the last. Her screams echoed through the night, but the farm was too far away for anyone to hear them. When the massacre ended, the killer, covered in blood, returned to the house, cleaned his hands, and remained. In the days following the massacre, the neighboring farmer noticed something strange. No one had seen the Gruber family, but the farm's chimneys continued to smoke. Someone was there. The animals were fed, and the dogs, although restless, did not bark. When they finally decided to investigate, they found the horrific scene. All the family members were dead, piled up in the barn, the bodies already beginning to rot. Most disturbing was what authorities discovered during their investigation. Not only had the killer killed the family with unimaginable brutality, but he had also continued to live in the house for several days. He fed himself, took care of the animals, and slept in the family's beds. The monster had not fled immediately. He was among them all the time. Police searched the farm for clues, but what they found only raised more questions. There were no signs of forced entry, and the mysterious footprints were still there, marked in the snow like a silent warning. In the attic, they found traces of someone who had been living there for weeks. Whoever it was, he watched the family, waiting for the right moment to attack. But who was the killer, and why did he do that? The Hinterkaifeck case was never resolved. Police interviewed dozens of suspects, but no one was incriminated. Some believed that the killer was someone from their own family, perhaps driven by hatred or envy. Others suggested it was a drifter who had found shelter in the attic, and others swore that the shadows in the attic still moved at night, as if something was there watching. Among these young people was Hans, a local boy who had never believed in the superstitions surrounding the farm. For him, they were just exaggerated stories to scare the most impressionable. One autumn night, when the full moon illuminated the path, he and some friends decided to prove that there was nothing supernatural on the farm. They were convinced that the only scary thing there was the silence. Equipped with flashlights and bottles of beer, the group crossed the forest to the farm, laughing and mocking the fear that the story provoked. When they arrived, the place was exactly as the legends described. A ruined building, covered in moss, with broken windows that looked like empty eyes staring back at them. The silence was almost oppressive. Hans, with a confident smile, was the first to cross the main door, which creaked alarmingly when opened. "See? No big deal," he said. But as they explored the inside of the house, something changed. The air became heavier, the environment denser, as if the farm was slowly absorbing them. As they walked through the dark corridors of the farm, a feeling of unease grew. The once carefree laughter began to fade, replaced by a tense silence. The footsteps of Hans and his friends echoed strangely loudly. One of the boys, Peter, felt a shiver run up his spine as he passed the barn. "This is where it all happened," he whispered, his voice wavering. He was trying to remain calm, but the oppressive atmosphere was beginning to penetrate his defenses. Suddenly, a sound came from above, a light shuffling, as if something was moving slowly in the attic. Everyone froze. "What was that?" asked Eva, one of the girls, trying to maintain control. Hans tried to laugh, but the sound died in his throat. "It must be an animal. Maybe a big rat," he muttered, without much conviction. But the sound continued, scratching, as if nails were ripping wood, slowly, with unsettling intent. "Maybe we should go," Peter suggested, clearly terrified. But before they could react, the flashlights began to flicker. The air became cold, and a strange, metallic smell filled the room, as if something very old and rotten was being released. Hans' heart began to race. He tried to say something, but was interrupted by a new sound. A low, guttural laugh, coming from the attic, followed by indistinct whispers that filled the room. The voices were not human. They came from somewhere much darker. Hans knew something was terribly wrong, but pride kept him from admitting his fear. "Let's go up and see what it is," he said, his voice sounding braver than he felt. Climbing up to the attic was the only way to end the mystery, or at least that's what he told himself. With the trembling flashlight in hand, he led the group to the stairs that led to the upper floor. Each step creaked, as if the house itself was telling them to leave. When they reached the top, what they saw froze the blood in their veins. The attic was covered in dark handprints on the walls, as if someone or something had tried to escape, scratching desperately at the wood. In the center of the rotting wooden floor was an old, dirty mattress, where someone had clearly slept. Around the mattress, strange and macabre symbols were carved into the floor, as if they were part of some kind of ancient ritual. But the worst was yet to come. Eva shone the flashlight into a darker corner of the attic and gave a muffled scream. A figure stood there, hunched over, its face covered in long, disheveled hair. His body was completely still, as if he was waiting for something. The lanterns flickered again, and for a brief moment Hans thought the figure was smiling. A cruel, distorted smile. The guttural laughter returned, now louder and closer, as if it were inside their heads. Panic took over the group and everyone began to retreat, but the figure moved. She didn't walk, she simply glided towards them, as if not bound by the physical laws of the world. "Run!" shouted Hans, and everyone ran downstairs in panic, trying to escape the presence that was now chasing them through the house. Terror gripped the group as they desperately tried to leave the farm. The doors that were previously open were now locked, as if the house itself wanted to keep them inside. The walls seemed to close in around them, and the sound of heavy footsteps followed every movement they made. Hans looked back and saw the dark figure approaching, faster and faster. The creature's eyes, or whatever it was, glowed in the dark, like embers burning with ancient hatred. Peter tried to pry open a window, but as soon as his fingers touched the glass, he was thrown back by an invisible force. The impact left him unconscious, and the entity's heavy breathing filled the air. "We have to leave now," cried Eva, holding Peter's limp body, while Hans desperately tried to open the door. The flashlights failed again, plunging everyone into total darkness. The laughter of the voices in the attic echoed through the house, now accompanied by horrible, incomprehensible whispers. Hans finally managed to open the door, and everyone ran outside. The cold night air hit them like a punch, but the relief was temporary. The shadows in the forest around the farm seemed to move. Hans understood, with horror, that the ritual they witnessed in the attic that night was not an isolated event. It was a cycle, a repetition that cursed anyone who dared come close. And now he was part of this curse. The dark laughter returned, followed by the macabre whispers, and the shadows began to move again. He had nowhere to run. Hinterkaifeck never let his victims go. The cycle was just beginning. Hans knew returning to the farm was insane, but he felt it was the only way to find answers. The days that followed that cursed night became a nightmare. Each night, he heard whispers, scratches on the walls, and laughter coming from inside his own home. Objects continued to disappear, and his mental health was deteriorating rapidly. His friends, Eva and Peter, were lost forever. Peter remained in a catatonic state, while Eva had disappeared after the last night she spoke to Hans. She said that they were coming to get her, and that there was no way to escape. Upon arriving at the farm again, Hans felt the air heavy, as if the atmosphere itself was permeated by the evil that lived there. He knew the farm was waiting for him. The fog enveloped the place in an almost supernatural way, making it difficult to see just a few meters ahead. As he passed through the rusty gates, he felt like he was being watched by something invisible. But this time he wasn't alone. The farm's own evil seemed more active, more alive. Hans entered the house with the shaky flashlight in his hands. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of his own footsteps. He knew he would have to go up to the attic. The stairs creaked beneath his feet as if protesting his presence. When he reached the top, he found the attic in the same way as before, with handprints on the walls and the stained mattress in the center. However, something new had been added. A large old mirror, covered in dust, leaned against the wall. The mirror caught Hans' attention in an almost hypnotic way. He knew he shouldn't get closer, but something was pulling him closer, as if the mirror had a life of its own. As he wiped away the layer of dust with a shaking hand, Hans saw his own reflection, and something else. Behind him, in the reflection, were the figures of the Gruber family, deformed and bloody, their faces contorted into expressions of pain and terror. He turned around immediately, but the attic was empty. Nothing was there but the oppressive silence. But when he looked in the mirror again, the family members were still there. They didn't move, they just watched him with blank eyes. Then, from the bottom of the reflection, a shadow began to approach. It was the same figure he and his friends had seen the night they first visited the farm. The creature, hunched over and faceless, moved slowly toward him in the mirror, its movements distorted and unnatural. She was getting closer, stepping through the reflection, ready to enter the real world. Desperately, Hans took a step back, but his feet caught on something. As he looked down, he noticed that the mattress in the attic was moving. Something was underneath him, trying to get out. Panic took over him, and, in a desperate act, he broke the mirror with a strong blow, scattering shards all over the floor. The shadow disappeared, but Hans knew this was not the end. He had released something much darker by breaking that mirror. Hans ran out of the attic, down the stairs with his heart racing. But the house seemed to have changed. The room was darker, and the whispers that once seemed distant were now deafening, as if all the voices of lost souls were echoing around them. When he got to the bottom floor, he noticed that the doors were all locked. He was trapped on the farm. As he tried to find a way out, Hans began to hear a familiar voice calling his name. It was Eva's voice. "Hans, come to me." He knew that it couldn't be real, but despair took over him. The voice called him to the barn, the same place where the Gruber family had been massacred. When he entered, the sight made him freeze in place. Eva was there, but not as he remembered. His skin was pale and his eyes were empty, with claw marks around his body. She was dead, and the distorted smile on her face was not that of someone alive. "You left me here," she whispered, her voice icy and full of pain. "Now you are part of it all. You will bring us together forever." Hans tried to walk away, but the bodies of the Gruber family began to materialize around him, as if emerging from the shadows of the barn. They were all dead, but still trapped on that farm, doomed to repeat the cycle of pain and death. The shadows began to approach, slowly engulfing Hans. When Hans tried to leave the barn, the doors closed with a bang. The voices and whispers grew louder, and the shadows surrounding him began to take on more defined shapes, contorted figures, as if made of smoke and darkness, but with eyes glowing with hate and pain. In the middle of the barn, the entity he had released by breaking the mirror began to manifest itself. The humanoid form, distorted and grotesque, seemed to feed on Hans' fear. The creature extended its long, twisted arms towards him, as if it wanted to pull him into the void it inhabited. The creature's voice was no ordinary voice. It was like an echo of all the lost souls on that farm, melded into a disturbing cacophony. "You dared to enter our